Hello everybody, welcome to week 3. This week we're going to talk about different theories that help explain why organizations choose different organizational structures. Now, last week we discussed parts of the structure, so this week we're going to talk about why organizations are structured the way that they are. It's going to be a little bit longer probably than last week, but I'll try to keep it fairly brief. So there's lots of different theories. If you go start looking at organizational theories, there's so many theories that try to explain why organizations choose particular structures. But this week we'll focus on some of the more common ones, and we'll start with some kind of a historical perspective, and then move into some more modern theories. So first what we're going to do is talk about some classical theories. First, classical theories. All these theories all have kind of a similar view. That the purpose of the organization is that they're organized in a way to lead to predetermined goals with maximum efficiency. These theories assume organizations are rational, and then they will then choose the best structure based on their particular goals, almost like decision making. Like organizations rationally decide, this is what we're trying to do, this is what structure we should have. So there's 3 main theories we're going to talk about under this heading of classical theories: scientific management, bureaucracy, and administrative management. So first, scientific management. This theory originated around the turn of the century with Taylor, and essentially this theory says that scientific principles should be used to determine how to maximize efficiency for maximum prosperity. They use science to determine the most appropriate way for employees to accomplish tasks, and then the jobs were formalized so that employees could adhere to these practices. So they studied how is the best way to do this, and then they formalized that into policy so employees would know the best way to do something. The theory also believes that tasks should be specialized, so employees are only responsible for a narrow range of tasks, so they don't have to learn multiple things. They just have to be proficient in one particular type of task. It's management's responsibility then to select the proper employees for the task, train them in the proper ways to accomplish the task, and then supervise them to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to do. A key part of this theory is that managers also have to be proficient in those tasks. Otherwise, how could they possibly have the ability to properly select, train, or supervise an employee if they're not also proficient in that task? This theory has led, in criminal justice, this theory has led to certain developments such as prediction instruments, physical agility tests, and other so-called evidence-based policies. This theory did have some criticism because employees were only viewed as a means to get tasks accomplished, just like cogs, in this greater organization, and really were unable to determine any possible derivations from the prescribed method. So really no employee input whatsoever in how the tasks were done. Scientifically, this is what we determine, and this is what's going to happen. The second one is bureaucratic theory, and this is from Max Weber. And his original writings espoused that the bureaucracy was the ideal organizational structure. Now, that's not exactly how it's viewed today. It's viewed today as being fairly inefficient, lots of red tape, that sort of thing. But this is probably the most common organizational structure today, especially in criminal justice. But if you look at private sector organizations, you look at clubs, many of them are set up in some sort of bureaucratic fashion, similar to what Weber proposes. Okay, bureaucracies are characterized by division of labor, hierarchy with a vertical complexity, going up, formalization, and selection and advancement based on merit, and then impersonal relations between employees and management. Okay, the whole point of a bureaucracy is it's supposed to be this really efficient way where all the different parts work together toward a common goal. And it does that through routinizing tasks, and eliminating uncertainty. Okay, so everything is very formalized. Everything is specialized. Everything is divided. Okay, so all the different parts just work together. They do their thing, and they work together through routine tasks. There's a clear chain of command, and everything is very predictable. The only problem is, because this theory relies on the routinization of tasks, it assumes that the organization exists in a predictable environment where the same interactions are occurring all the time. Or, as it's known, as a closed system, where it only depends on what's going on inside the organization. What's going on outside doesn't have make any kind of difference. Just what's going on inside is what matters. This is certainly not the type of environment that criminal justice organizations function in, okay? Which is interesting because this is how most criminal justice organizations are structured. And even though there's this hierarchy that's supposed to create efficiency, through chain of command, communication, all those things that this hierarchy is supposed to do, clear supervision, it also creates inefficiency because those in the hierarchy can interrupt communication through any kind of through a variety of methods. They can hide things from people above them. It's supposed to create this really efficient system, but there's lots of inefficiency within it. Bureaucracies also encourage a focus on means over ends, which can lead the organization to only worry about how it's functioning rather than what it's actually accomplishing. And this is why you have things in criminal justice like focus on paperwork, right? You got to have paperwork to justify how things are running. This is why chain of command is so important, right? It worries more about how they're doing things rather than what they're actually doing. So because it focuses on the means, it assumes that everyone does what they're supposed to do, and then the ends will take care of themselves, right? So it assumes that we're going to make sausage, and we're going to worry about how we're making it, and then at the end, we'll have sausage. Where something else, like a more organic kind of structure, would worry more about the fact that sausage gets made rather than how it actually gets made. Workers are also lost in a bureaucracy, and they're generally ignored, except as part of the hierarchy in fulfilling their particular task. Okay. Third one we're going to look at is administrative management. Now, while scientific management focuses on the workers predominantly, this theory focuses more on management. Okay, and in this theory, management is important for putting forth that the administration is important in the accomplishment of tasks. Okay, and the administration includes planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. It goes on to discuss 14 different principles in the book. I'm not going to go through them all here because that would make this even longer than what it's going to be today. But be sure to read them and think about how it applies to management and then how it differs from scientific management. When you get into those, you'll see that most of those principles fall into the coordination, control, and complexity dimensions of the organizational structure. Now, this theory was highly criticized when it came out. But if you look at criminal justice organizations today, you can certainly see the influence of this administrative management theory in many criminal justice organizations. All right, so those are your classical theories. So let's move on now to human relations theory. Now, this theory views employees as much more than just simply cogs in a large machine. Okay, this theory focuses on them as individuals. And there's a series of studies called the Hawthorne studies, and they found that people can have as much influence on how work gets accomplished as can the formal design of organizations. Okay, prior to this, theories all focused on the organizational dimensions and how they would get work done. Human relations theory says that humans, the employees, the people that work there, have just as much impact on that as does the design of the organization. So two important theories that emerged out of this were Theory X and Theory Y. Theory X suggests that workers are pretty much uninterested and won't do anything unless management makes them. It assumes they're by nature lazy and uninterested in accomplishing organizational goals and will only work for financial benefit. Because of that, control is necessary, right? Management has to control everything that they do. Management has to make them do what they need them to do. Theory Y is kind of the exact opposite of that. Okay, so Theory Y, in contrast, suggests that workers can achieve great satisfaction from their work. You don't need to have nearly as much control because workers are committed to the organization and the organization's goals. So while Theory X suggests that more bureaucracy is necessary for the accomplishment of goals, Theory Y suggests that less bureaucracy and formal controls are necessary. So kind of the main criticisms of, and Theory Z has actually come out since then, that kind of takes the best parts of both and puts them together for more of a middle-of-the-road kind of theory where management is responsible for setting things up to where people can achieve their goals, and that people will do their jobs, but it's not to the extremes. It's more of a working together kind of theory. So main criticisms of human relations theory are that the organization's main goals should not be satisfying employees, and that happy employees do not necessarily equate to increased productivity. And while broadly that may be true, I don't think anyone can argue that employees are important to an organization, and their satisfaction and happiness has to be, at least be a consideration for organizations. All right, open systems theories. These theories are probably more applicable to criminal justice organizations today because criminal justice organizations don't operate in a closed system, right? They don't get to focus only on their internal workings. They have to interact with their environment. And open systems theory suggests that. Okay, open systems theory says you have to interact with your environment. So the first one is contingency theory. Contingency theory suggests that organizations will select the best structure for them based on this variety of factors or contingencies. Okay, it assumes that organizations are rational and that they will make the best decision by taking all these factors into account when determining how to structure itself. So kind of the main criticism of this theory is, at what point do you stop considering contingencies? Like, how many contingencies do you consider? Because there are seemingly an impossible number of contingencies that an organization would have to consider, right? I mean, how do you decide which ones are important and which ones are not? Who decides that, right? And then what happens down the road when contingencies change? Okay, so the other main criticism is that can organizations actually make these rational decisions? Okay, organizations, especially bureaucratic ones, are known for being unable to link their structures to outcomes. So what happens when contingencies change? If they chose a bureaucracy initially because of certain characteristics, what happens when contingencies change and bureaucracy is no longer the proper way to do that, or proper way to structure themselves? Bureaucracies are notoriously hard to change. So what happens then? Okay, so that's kind of the biggest criticism of contingency theory is, it's all fine and good to say that they should consider all these different issues, but how many of them, which ones, and then what happens when they change? So then we have resource dependency theory. Now this theory simply says that organizations don't make decisions solely based on what structure is best, but rather take into account where the resources are coming from and how that would affect their structure. So no one will argue organizations have to have resources to survive. Now there's a lot of different ways that criminal justice organizations can get resources. But to do that, they have to enter into exchange agreements, right? Even talking about, if you're a municipal police department, you're in an exchange relationship with the city council. They give you money in exchange for things, right? They give you resources in exchange for you doing certain things. But what happens when they enter agreements with other types of agencies? Okay, sometimes those agencies require different things from them. A prime example is grant funding for things like community policing in the 80s and 90s, and more recently Homeland Security practices. In order to get those funds, organizations had to do certain things. They had to adopt certain practices or certain structures. So sometimes agencies will simply do that only to get that money, whether they really need whatever it is they have to do or not. Okay. Another good example is there was quite a bit of money for a while for gang task forces. Well, if there's money available for a gang task force, the police department will say, well, we'll create a gang task force. Do they have a gang problem? Who knows, right? but it could give them influence over how that organization functions and how that organization is structured. And it's not that big of a deal if everyone acts ethically, but there's always chances for unethical behavior, and some funding organizations could exert undue influence on other agencies. But then the other question is then, if you change your structure to get whatever resources, what happens when those resources are no more? Right? What happens when the funding for community policing runs out? Do you keep those structures? Do you keep doing community policing, or do you change and do something else? So that's one of the main criticisms about resource dependency theory, is what happens. Okay. So then you have institutional theory. This is the last one we're going to talk about today. This theory suggests that organizations structure themselves based on what's expected of them, regardless of whether or not it's efficient or effective. Okay, and this theory is tied very closely to organizational legitimacy. If you think about criminal justice organizations, certain structures come to mind. Certain structures are associated with certain types of agencies, right? Police departments look a certain way generally. Prisons generally look a certain way when you look at their structures. Why? Well, part of it could be this institutional theory. Okay, what happens if an organization does not structure itself in what is considered to be an acceptable manner? They could risk losing legitimacy among other agencies. This, if you have a police department that says, you know what, we're not going to have a paramilitary bureaucratic structure, we're going to have this much flatter structure, we're not going to have paramilitary designations, rank structure. What happens when they talk to people from other agencies? Are those other agencies going to be like, man, that sounds great? Or are they going to say, what in the world are you doing? How can you be a police agency if you don't have such and such structures? Okay, so it can lead to a loss of legitimacy there. This theory can also lead to what's known as isomorphism, which means agencies resemble each other. There's three types of isomorphism. There's coercive isomorphism, coercive isomorphism, where agencies are forced to adopt certain structures. You have mimetic isomorphism, where organizations will mimic other organizations that they view are legitimate or successful. And then you have normative isomorphism, and this is more related to education and training, where practices or ways of doing things are brought back to organizations from a training session or something like that. So it's kind of an example of institutional theory. When I was a conservation officer, I used to work with a small town municipal police agency. They had three officers. They had a chief, they had a sergeant, and they had a patrol officer. So I'm hoping right now the question you're asking is, why did they have a sergeant? Right? What was the point of having a sergeant when you only had three officers? The answer to that is I have no idea. But it probably has something to do with institutional theory. Right? There's also a common theory when you look at the structures of campus police agencies. We all know the common thing that people say about campus police agencies is that they're not real police agencies. Even if they are, that's kind of what they say. They're rent-a-cops or they're Paul Blart, right? So how do you combat that? What do you do? Well, oftentimes they will organize themselves to resemble other police agencies that they view as legitimate, whether or not that's the actual structure that they need. They may be able to structure themselves differently, to accomplish what they need to accomplish at their particular campus. But they do that. Does that make them look less legitimate? According to this theory, it does, right? So they organize themselves to resemble other police agencies that they view as legitimate. Another example is the Michigan State University Police Department. And this is something I talk about in my undergraduate organizations class. If you look at their organizational structure, they've got stuff like their own CSI unit, they've got a gang task force, they've got a fugitive surveillance team. They have all these different things that regular police agencies would have. And of course the question is, do they need that on Michigan State University's campus? Probably not. But what does it do when they have those things? It increases their legitimacy as a legitimate police agency. So institutional theory, I think, has a lot of influence when you start looking at how different organizations structure themselves. Okay, so I've probably already gone on a little bit too long for this week, but please be sure to read the articles at the end of the chapter. And then as you're reading those, think about how these different theories would apply in each of those cases. The McDonaldization of the criminal justice system. This is a topic that's coming up more and more frequently, so it really is something that's timely. And then Rosecrans has his article about probation pre-sentence reports. So as always, if you have questions, please let me know. And make sure you do the discussion board, and I'll see you next week.